Welcome to the Military Justice Today podcast with your host, Robert Capovilla and Mickey Williams, covering the full range of military law topics from all branches of the armed forces. Today's episode is made possible in part by the law firm of Capovilla and Williams. And now, let's welcome the hosts of the show, Rob and Mickey.
All right, everybody, here we go. Another episode of Military Justice Today. I'm Matt Starosiak in the studio with my colleague and friend, Robert Capovilla. Hello, Robert.
Hey, Matt. How you doing?
I'm doing great. So I guess the obvious thing our listeners want to know is how I survived the coup. You guys trying to do a podcast without me. Is that right?
That's right. It was actually quite, I didn't like giving the intro, Matt. You're much better at it than me. And it sort of felt like giving an opening statement in a trial, which is always kind of the most nerve-wracking moment of trial, to be honest with you.
Well, you guys did a great job. That was a phenomenal episode, actually, to hear Mickey and Dan, combat veterans, talking about an issue that's hot right now and agreeing on some of it and disagreeing on some of it. I thought that was a phenomenal episode.
I thought it was a necessary episode. I think there's a lot of misinformation out there about what's true and what's not regarding Governor Walz's military record, and we were happy to comment on it.
Welcome to all of our listeners. We've kind of had a trend here of some phenomenal guests on our show, and today's no different. We've got Dr. Patrick Morley, best-selling author and really just a leader in the faith community. We're going to bring him in a minute, but really just great to be able to get these guests on our show over and over and talking about great things. Dr. Morley, can you hear us?
Yes, I got you.
Okay, great. Well, thank you for being on the show today. I know you've been asked to do a lot since the release of your latest book. We really appreciate you joining the Military Justice Today podcast, sir.
It's such an honor to be with you. I'm a veteran, and I love talking to vets and active duty people, so this is fantastic for me as well.
Well, the honor is all ours. We don't like to read too much on this show, but I do have a portion of your biography, and I think that's probably the best way to give your credentials and your background the justice it deserves. So I'm going to read a little bit, and then we'll bring you back in. We'll talk a little bit of pre-show banter on a topic we're excited to talk about, and then we're going to hear a lot about the great work that you do. So Dr. Patrick Morley has been the president or managing partner of 59 companies and partnerships, many in the commercial real estate industry. After building one of Florida's 100 largest privately held companies by the age of 35, he thought, there must be more to life than this. There's got to be. Motivated by his own search for meaning, purpose, and a deeper relationship with God, he started a weekly Bible study in a bar, no less, with a handful of guys in 1986, a study that now reaches thousands of men around the world every week. Inspired and challenged by those studies and conversations, he wrote The Man in the Mirror, named one of the 100 most influential Christian books of the 20th century. Widely regarded as a leading authority on men's issues, Patrick has written 23 books, more than 750 articles, all focused on helping men solve their most compelling problems. With over 7 million copies in print, his award-winning books have been translated into languages worldwide and printed in 48 countries. Patrick earned his Ph.D. in Leadership and Organizational Change, a master's degree from Reformed Theological Seminary, marketing degree, which I like, of course, from the University of Central Florida, and you've completed studies at Harvard and Oxford. You and your wife live in Florida. You've got 2 grown children who are married and 5 grandchildren. And not to be forgotten, you're a veteran of the armed forces. And so thank you, sir, for your service. And again, it's great to have you on the podcast. Welcome.
Well, thank you. Gosh, that guy you just introduced, he must really be old.
That's what everybody says when they've got a long list of credentials is, well, that all sounds good, but it's hard to believe.
Not just a veteran, Matt, a veteran of the 82nd Airborne Division. So one of our most cherished divisions in all of the United States Army.
Yep. Iconic, that's for sure.
Well, what a phenomenal background. I can't imagine the amount of hard work you've put into it and still do today. So we're anxious to kind of get into the topics and especially your new book. But we always do a pre-show question, and we were talking a little bit here a few moments ago off air about the new Wyatt Earp series on Netflix. And then we kind of transitioned into favorite Western movies. But you've watched that Netflix series, right, with Wyatt Earp?
Oh, my gosh, it's the greatest thing going, I'm telling you. It's got like a 8.0 rating on IMDb, and I thought it was going to be like this total documentary thing, and it kind of is. They have some historians opining along the way, but it's very much a dramatic movie. It's fantastic. It's wonderful.
Have you finished it? Because it's what? Is it 6 episodes?
Right.
I did. I finished it. Yeah.
Yeah. And narrated by Ed Harris, which you can't go wrong with that. So you loved it, Robert. What about?
Have you seen it? How much of it have you seen?
I watched all 6. I had a trial last week, Pat, and when it got done, I went home, and I'm a huge one of my twin boys. His name is Wyatt, and I'm a huge fan of the American West, and I sat down and I binge watched, which I don't do very often. I watched all 6 episodes, and I thought it was just fantastic. I couldn't turn it off. I thought it was so good and so informative.
Well, it was, and the fact that it was based on reality and truth. Historians trying to actually reconstruct what happened in the story of Wyatt Earp and the Cowboy War. If you're listening and haven't heard about it, it's about the Cowboy War. I didn't even know we had a Cowboy War. This is about 20 years after the Civil War, but it's fascinating, and it was so well acted. Loved it.
It was, and I was also very taken back by the trial that it talks about in the Netflix, in the documentary or docuseries.
Yep.
I was obviously familiar with the OK Corral. I knew who Doc Holliday was and Wyatt Earp and those guys. I did not know that he was actually charged with murder, and there was a subsequent, kind of a preliminary hearing / a trial that took place.
Spoiler alert, everybody!
Yeah,
spoiler alert.
it was really cool, and it was I thought good for lawyers too to watch, because it does talk about the weight of evidence and credibility, and obviously I also didn't know that the Vendetta ride was 100% true and accurate. I had thought that with Tombstone, the movie, maybe Hollywood had taken some liberties, but it sounds pretty darn accurate.
It sure does. It was great.
Well, I finished 5 of 6, so I've got one more to go. I started watching it this weekend and watched a couple episodes each day. I thought it was very good. I thought it was great to learn about the history of it. Obviously, Tombstone, a great movie, but Tombstone takes some liberties with the timing of things. I didn't realize that there had been that much time elapsed between the different attacks and that kind of stuff. I felt like they spent a little too much time on the legal aspects of it, the trial, and then, it's like they're in the courtroom all the time and there's accusations. I could have done a little bit less of that, but the historical accuracy of it is really cool. And I'm looking forward to seeing the last. I would have thought there would have been more people killed on the Vendetta ride. I think there were only 4 cowboys that were actually killed. Not like that's
a lot of people.
Insignificant, but Tombstone made it sound like he was, going around 20 people, 30 people.
Like on a rampage.
Yeah. I mean, the thing about it is, the story now is kind of viewed as the last kind of cry out of the Old West, right? And after that, the mine shut down and civilization moved in, and that's why I think it's a cool piece of history. But there's no getting around the fact that Wyatt Earp, whether you think he was right or whether you think he was wrong, certainly by today's standards, would have been guilty of murder. And it's a fascinating story about people and interactions during really a time frame in history that America's always been enthralled by, right? The Wild West. It's part of our identity.
Yeah, just a fun watch.
Yeah, it definitely is. It definitely is. So, Pat, I want to go ahead and shift now and talk a little bit about why we're here today. And I want to say that to our listeners out there that Dr. Morley, Pat, is written several books on healing and the purpose of suffering. And when I asked Pat to join the podcast, I did so to guide it towards our veterans and our active duty service members that have seen war, that have been on deployments, that are still in that healing process as the war on terror comes to a close. And we have a generation of young men and young women who are searching for answers potentially and dealing with the trauma of war. And so I asked Pat to come on to talk about this idea from his brilliant book, How God Makes Men, which is my favorite work from Pat, and really talk about the principles of suffering for no apparent reason. And I know a lot of these principles that you talk about, Pat, are also in your new book, From Broken Boy to Mended Man. Do you want to kind of introduce some of those topics to our listeners?
Well, I think of course, suffering is like this huge, expansive topic, right? And I think I would, just off of the top of my head, introduce it this way. So the world, and when the Bible talks about the world, and I'm going to talk in plain English here, but I am a Bible teacher among other things. And when the Bible talks about the world, it's really talking about the fallen, unregenerate world, the world that's broken, basically. And so I like to think that it's accurate to say that the world is a never sleeping juggernaut that relentlessly crushes everything in its path, our hopes, our dreams, our plans, our relationships. And so your listeners, if they're like me, it's kind of like you have one hand and you're reaching out for a hopeful future, but the other hand, you're holding back this big giant ball, this big giant juggernaut that's trying to roll over you. And occasionally your hand slips and it comes over and it crushes your leg or worse, and creates suffering, and for no apparent reason, which of course is what the chapter's about. And a lot of times men don't even understand where these, and women too, don't even understand. I apologize to the women. I'm a men's author, so I tend to speak to men, but of course these are universal principles, so they apply to men and women. But yeah, so anyway, but then a lot of times men, they have these destructive behaviors, and that they're dragging them down, and they don't even know where they're coming from. And that's why I've written, well, both of these books, to be candid.
One of the central themes of From Broken Boy to Mended Man, and also from How God Makes Men, is this idea that God makes men by allowing us to go through suffering what can be gained in no other way. And to highlight this principle, you really talk about Job 1 and 2. Why don't you introduce Job to our listeners, and then we can sort of talk about some of the principles that you highlight in your work.
So Job, if you are not familiar with his story, he is a key figure in the Old Testament. That's the first part of the Bible. In fact, there's an entire book called Job, and he's famous for a couple of things. First of all, he's famous for going through what can only be called suffering of unsurpassed proportion. So honestly, if you're out there today, and it really doesn't make any difference how badly you're suffering, if you have PTS and you're ripping your family apart, or your family's being ripped apart by a spouse that has it, or if you have a child that's off reservation, if there's addiction, whatever it is. Let me just give you Job's suffering resume. So he had a bunch of children, and his entire family was killed in a natural disaster. And then shortly thereafter, his entire business empire, and the Bible says that Job was a very wealthy man, his entire business empire collapsed. And then after that, his health failed, and he's literally sitting around and scraping his skin with a piece of pottery. He's just a completely broken man. And the second thing that Job is famous for is asking all these questions of God about suffering. And perhaps a third thing, just as a sidebar, one day his wife said to him, why don't you just curse God and die?
Right.
But Job says, though he slay me, yet will I hope in him. And so even though Job had all of these questions of God, the one thing that he didn't do is he never lost his integrity and never accused God of wrongdoing. But just to carry that one step further, and the other big thing to know about Job in the introduction is that even though he asks God all these questions, God remains silent for a long, long time. And that's the introduction to Job.
Pat, one of the quotes from Job and his response to suffering, and obviously this is when I remember reading Job as a child and being confused about, geez, God seems awfully mean to this poor man.
Yep.
Obviously, my thoughts have changed as I've gone through some of my own trauma and setbacks in life. But I want to share with you one of the quotes from Job, and it's really about his response to suffering. And I'd love to get your thoughts on it because it's a quote that I have prayed about many times in my own personal life. And Job says this: "Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I shall return there. The Lord gave, and the Lord taketh away. Blessed be the name of the Lord." What is Job saying what is Job saying there? What is his point and purpose of that wonderful quote?
So I could write a book about just that one statement, and probably you could too, but a few thoughts that come to my mind immediately. And if you're out there and you're listening, see if this doesn't make sense to you. Job was acknowledging that God is the Almighty. And the way I would say today is that God is sovereignly orchestrating all human events. In other words, he either causes or allows everything that happens to happen. In other words, there are evil things that happen, and he could prevent them, but he doesn't. One of the great mysteries, and probably the Achilles heel of Christianity, to be honest about it. Most people that reject Christianity would reject it because they just can't understand why God would allow evil and suffering, but he does. And so what Job is doing is he's saying he is acknowledging the sovereignty of God, and he's affirming that his belief that not only is God in charge, that he is great and that he is good. And so, naked I came, naked I depart. So in our family, 38 days ago, our 48-year-old daughter died instantly and unexpectedly of a heart attack.
I'm sorry to hear this, my friend.
And she's left behind a wonderful husband that she adored, and two beautiful teenage daughters, 17 and 14, to whom she was devoted. She was athletic, jogged and everything, was in good health, and so we still don't have the autopsy back on it. But so my wife and I are in agreement. We've been through many, many major sufferings, business things, which they come and go. But I did have a 7-year business battle that ended in disaster, and then I had a brother who died at the age of 31. I was 35 at the time. He was 31. He died of a heroin overdose, a Vietnam vet that never really got over it and took his life. And so, and then I quit high school in the middle of my senior year. So that means I probably grew up in a dysfunctional family. Yes, I did. And there's some troubles there, even though I had great parents, but nice parents but they didn't know how to be parents. But this current suffering that we're going through, it is easily the hardest thing we've ever had to go through. And it's interesting that text from the book of Job in the Bible that you just quoted, that's one that I've been holding on to. That's one I've been holding on to.
I'm sorry to hear about your recent struggles, Pat, and I think our listeners are obviously agree. Our prayers are with you and your wife and your family as you guys deal with this tragic loss. Let me ask you this: when I talk to friends in my life or acquaintances in my life who are non-believers, especially veterans, the first thing they do bring up is, well, if there was a God, I wouldn't have seen that little boy hit by an IED, or if there was a God, my battle buddy would not have been killed in combat, or, the list goes on. And you actually quote C.S. Lewis in your book and what he talks about regarding this topic. So let me ask you, when you get asked that question and you think about the principles in Job, how do you reconcile, even in your own suffering now, how do you reconcile that there can be a benevolent and loving God, but there can also be true challenges that come to us at all phases of our lives?
Of course, that's what I'm getting at in this chapter, the book that we're talking about here, and then also in my newest book, From Broken Boy to Mended Man. It's interesting because I love meeting with men one-on-one. That's my favorite thing to do. And in fact, I just set a lunch for next Wednesday with a guy I met this morning, and can't wait, and to hear his story and get to know him. But here's the thing: when sometimes you're on top of the mountain, right? Other times you're down in the valley, and then sometimes you're down in the valley under a pile of rocks. So usually when I end up getting with a guy, it's because things are not going well, and because I work with men as a vocation, so it would make sense, right? They don't call me up to celebrate the promotions, right?
right.
And, I get the call when they just lost the job or the contract, right? And so anyway, but the point of it is, when men try to put into words what they feel like is holding them back, what they feel like is keeping them from feeling fully alive, they will inevitably mention one or more of 7 characteristics. And so in the Broken Boy book, I talk about this being part of what healthy male behavior looks like, is to have better answers to these questions or these issues. Number one, a guy will say, I just feel like I'm in this alone. Number 2, I don't feel like God cares about me personally, not really, usually because of some kind of a suffering. Third, I don't feel like my life has purpose. It feels random. Number 4, I have these destructive behaviors that keep dragging me back down. Number 5, my soul feels dry. Number 6, my most important relationships, they're not healthy. And then finally, number 7, I really don't feel like I'm doing anything that's going to make a difference and leave the world a better place. And so this amount of inner turmoil, not to mention some of the outward things that happen to people, like, injuries, physical injuries, health problems, and so forth. These are the existential problems, if you will, that cause us to question whether God, are you even really there?
Right.
And if you are there, do you know what's going on? Because if you know what's going on, it doesn't look like you care. And if you do know what's going on and you do care, then you must not have the power to do anything about it, because otherwise, why would you let this happen? And we're not going to fully answer that today, but except to say that in the Bible, we do find, honestly, very satisfying answers to those questions. And it all starts, this is too long of an answer, but I'll say one more thing. This really all starts with the idea of the fall. Some of your listeners may not have heard of it in such a way that they understand, but the fall means the fall of the first man and the first woman, Adam and Eve. And I heard a scholar one time, it's Blaise Pascal. He's the French mathematician, theologian. And, I have a lot of books that I own, but his book owns me. It's really a great book. And
Right.
And he says something, and I'm going to paraphrase him. He says, the fall is an offense to human reason. But once accepted, it makes perfect sense of the human condition. Can I say that again? The fall is an offense to human reason, but once you accept it, it makes perfect sense of the human condition. So it's not only God that's in the equation. There are other forces of evil that are in the equation too. And so it's really, this is the problem of gratuitous suffering, or suffering for no apparent reason, or even unjust suffering, but just gratuitous evil. Why does it even happen? And it's honestly that question is so easily answered deductively, but psychologically it's still a big problem. And the only way that I know for a man or a woman to really come to grips with the suffering is to investigate it to investigate what God says about suffering.
I think that's so well said, Pat. And I'm going to shift gears here just a little bit from Job to Paul, I'll share this with you. I was raised in a home by my father. My mom and dad divorced at a very young age, and my father was a self-proclaimed atheist to the day he died. And he used to tell a story about how he prayed to Jesus and accepted in his mind Jesus in his heart, but his life did not get any easier. And he used to argue that was proof to him, at least, that there was no God. And that was something I thought a lot about growing up, right? Is why doesn't life get easier if we accept Jesus Christ as our Lord and Savior? And then I remember after my dad's sort of tragic passing, I began to pray a lot more and go back to some of my roots that my grandmother had introduced me to. And I began to read Paul and his letters, which make up the majority of the New Testament, as you know. And I remember thinking a lot about Paul's statement about the thorn in his side, right? And here's this man that is devoted to God and devoted to the Messiah, and actually Christ himself spoke to him on the road to Damascus and throughout his journey, across the ancient world, preaching what he preached. And yet this man's character was deeply filled with prayer and a deeply held belief in his mission. And yet here he is still talking about the thorn in his side. And I remember thinking, if Paul himself still suffers, if Paul himself goes through more hardships than most of us could ever imagine, then what's the message there? And so talk about that a little bit, Pat. What is the message there when Paul talks about the thorn in his side? What is he getting at?
Well, it's fascinating because no one knows what that thorn in the flesh was. Many people have speculated. Nobody, not one person, knows what it is conclusively. People have different theories and so forth, but nobody knows for sure. Well, it's interesting because he could have easily, and the Lord could have inspired him to easily be specific about what that thorn was, right?
Right.
So let's just speculate for a minute. It could have been a physical problem or a physical ailment. It could have been, it could have been low energy. It could have been eyes. Some people think it might have been eyes. It could have been a relationship problem. It could have, it could be a broken relationship with a sibling or something like that. It could be financial problems. It could be the fact that Paul never had enough money to rub two nickels together. So it could have been a lot of things. And if you're listening, why do you suppose that was left obscure? Well, I have a hypothesis. And so that puts it in the realm of opinion. I can't prove this either, but I think that it's possible, highly probable, in fact, that God intentionally did not identify the specific thorn in the flesh. Are you ready for this?
I'm ready. I'm all ears for this.
So that you could see yourself in the story. Yeah. And so
wow, I've not thought about it that way. Wow.
Yeah. So each of you listening today, you have a thorn in your flesh of some kind. It might be, it could be anything. It could be an addiction. It could be a substance. It could be pornography. It could be that you have rage inside of you and you don't even know where it's coming from. Or it could be, I've got these 9 characteristics of men who grow up without having processed their childhood wounds, and you have a hard time believing that people really care about you. That's my number 1, by the way. And you are oversensitive and frequently misread what other people intend. I already said easily angered. You're not really sure what healthy male behavior looks like. You're oversensitive. I said that. You're either the responsible son or especially immature for your age, and all these different things, and you don't even know, why those things are happening. So, I want to encourage you that if you have some kind of suffering in your life, is to understand that suffering will often compel us to seek the God that success makes us think we don't need. And men, we make idols of things, and not just material things, but we make idols of positions, reputations, rank. We make things that we put in front of God that we say, okay, I believe in God, but in order to be happy, I need to be an E8.
Right.
I believe in God, but in order to be happy, I need to live in this neighborhood, have my kids go to that school, whatever it is. And I'm just going to tell you straight up, men and women, God loves you too much to let that stand. And so he will often allow suffering into our lives so that we will be compelled to seek the God that success made us think we don't need. And that's the truth.
You know, Pat, this topic, this idea of as people, we tend to, even if we're Christians, even if we have a solemn belief in Jesus Christ and our Heavenly Father, I know in my own life, I sometimes struggle with what is success for me, right? Is it the amount of money that I make, the number of cases that we win, how big my firm gets? And that brings me back to Job. And there's a quote from your book that I think is profound, and it's something that I've thought a lot about in my own life. And you write about Job as he's kind of in the midst of his suffering, that it was his suffering that led him to hear God as he never heard God before. And here is a man who, by all accounts, is righteous even before he suffers, right? He's a man of integrity. He's built a wonderful life for himself. And yet you write this quote that it was the suffering that led him closer to God. What did you mean by that? And just kind of talk about that idea with our listeners who, may be coming back from, are carrying the scars of war, or their families are having to up and move every 3 or 4 years. What is your main idea behind that quote?
Well, I don't want to, what would be the correct word, belittle or insult or make little of anyone's sufferings. We call it suffering because it hurts.
Right.
Inherent in that. And Jesus himself, he said, don't worry about tomorrow. Tomorrow will take care of itself. Each day has enough trouble of its own. Jesus said that. And one thing I admire about Christianity is that it does not promise some kind of utopian world. It describes the world exactly as we have it. And so to the person who, is suffering, I would just say that what Job is gets at throughout his entire book is that God is in the process of sanctifying us and maturing us, making us into examples and models for other people to follow after us. And then almost everybody on this call would also understand, or on this podcast would also understand, that if you just always get your own way, you just become a little spoiled brat.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah. And so anybody that says children knows that there needs to be structure, and it should not be too little structure, but it shouldn't be too much structure either. And that's one of the points in the book From Broken Boy to Mended Man, is that parenting is giving your children. First of all, it's an incredible privilege to be a parent, and it's about giving your children the right cocktail of love, structure, roots, and wings. And so when you get that, if you grew up in a home where parents gave you the verbal and the physical affection and the reinforcement, and then they gave you the right structure, not too much, but not too little either, so that you knew where the guardrails were. One time I took our family up on Whiteside Mountain in North Carolina, and there's a cliff that plummets 750 feet down to the floor of the canyon.
Right.
And I let my kids walk right out to the edge of the cliff, man. I'm telling you, just like that. Well, why did I do that? Well, because there were guardrails.
right
at the edge of the cliff. Yeah. And so there was protection from danger. And so giving your children guardrails is so important. So love structure roots, and that is, giving them that safe place where they know that they can come home when they get picked on at school. And then wings is helping them find some things they can do well, figure out who they are and what their lives are about, and so they can leave the nest. And so if you're listening and you got the right cocktail of those things, then you would probably say, my parents were affirming, or my parents were encouraging. But as I say in From Broken Boy to Mended Man, what if you can't say that?
right
Well, then you might say there are 7 negative parenting styles that create suffering. And number 1 is my parents were passive. They just weren't interested in me. Number 2, they were absent, maybe divorce, maybe death, maybe addiction, whatever, maybe working too much. Number 3, my parents were permissive. They just let you have your own way. And my wife and I, when we were dating, she said, I think your parents gave you too much say. And it was really true. So what happens when you get too much say? Well, I was filled with pride and really had a chip on my shoulder. And that's part of the reason I ended up quitting high school. But when I did quit high school, my father drove me down to the Army enlistment office because he wasn't going to let me hang around the house.
right
And the Army was the best thing that ever happened to me, because that structure, that discipline knocked the chip off my shoulder. So the Army has this fantastic training program to build the world's greatest fighting force, but it's also a system that's perfectly designed to knock the chips off the shoulders of
that's exactly right.
Prideful young men.
The Army will humble you one way or another. That is for sure. Pat, I know we're kind of coming towards the end of our time here together,
yeah.
and but I do want to ask you a little bit about your own personal journey, because you were a guy who was exceptionally successful in the business world. And as you were building this incredible business, you were also trying to balance that with Christ's teachings, right? With how to live as Christ lived. Talk to me just and this could be a whole podcast by itself, brother. And I know we don't have the time to do that today, but just talk to me about what was that transition like for you, going from a businessman, commercial real estate, financial success, to all of a sudden understanding your call from God was different, and that it made you totally change this course of action. Talk to me about that process as best you can, because it's something that I know I can relate to personally, and it's something that I think a lot of our listeners can relate to.
Yeah. Well, preface A is that a calling to ministry is no more holy or reverent than a calling to be in the military, to be an attorney, to be a landscaper, a bookkeeper, or anything else. Every vocation is holy to the Lord. So I guess I had a little, when I made the transition, I felt very called to business, but then one day I didn't. I felt called to help men, as many men as possible, to basically heal their childhood wounds and identify their destructive behaviors, and then how to become fully alive. That's really what I've given my life to, and to reach as many men as possible there. But so to be honest, okay, here it is. I thought that I know that every vocation's holy to God, but I thought Rob, I thought that maybe I would wake up one morning and look in the mirror, and I never thought anybody else would see it, but I thought I would see at least a little faint trace of a halo over my head in the mirror.
Right.
Because now I'm doing God's work,
Yeah.
I'm still waiting for that one.
I understand.
And the second part of the answer is that when I was in business, I used to say often, one day a week, if you give me $1, you can have the whole thing, because one day a week was just so hard, you just couldn't even believe it. You know? But now that I'm in ministry, I don't feel that way anymore. Now it's 2 days a week.
Right. I appreciate that answer, and your story. I've always listened and read intently when you talk about that personal journey, because I know as a businessman myself, as a guy who's got individual goals and in terms of finance and the things that I want to accomplish through my business. I've always found your story to be one that I could relate to. You know, you're a guy that was very successful in the business end, and you gave a lot of that up to pursue God's calling. And I know Matt is looking at me right now, and he says he has a question for you. I want to say that this is a non-sponsored question by Capavilla Williams. I have no idea what's going to come out of his mouth. So
we need to put the disclaimer out there that they normally do. This opinion doesn't reflect the views of this station. Pat, we're coming down kind of to the end of the episode. We really appreciate you coming on again. It's been a fascinating discussion. We'd love to have you back. I suspect you're not done writing books, and we'd love to have you back to talk about your next one.
It would be an honor. It would be an honor.
But I do have a question for you, and I guess it's just maybe a piece of advice or a suggestion that you would give to a man or a woman who is kind of trying to find their way. They're open to the idea of religion. It might be open to the idea of developing a stronger relationship with God, but they're not really sure exactly what next step to take. What would you advise them to do? Is it a service project? Is it reading scripture? Would it be, seeing somebody, maybe a clergy person? What would be your advice to somebody who is open but not really sure what the next best step is?
Well, it depends a little bit on the person, doesn't it? Their personality, temperament, how much they know, if they have a religious background or not. But here I like to put things in three buckets, okay? So let me say bucket number one is that you are not really sure God even exists. The things we're talking about today are very troubling questions to you about suffering and so forth. So I'm going to tell you about three books that you can get of mine. All of my books are designed to help people overcome some obstacle that's holding them back from experiencing faith. And most of my books, 22 of my 23 books, have been written from the standpoint, I've done my homework, you can trust me, here's what you need to know. But in this case, this book I'm about to mention, it's different. Don't take my word for it. Here is the evidence. You make up your own mind. And it's not the standard of a civil case, but a criminal case beyond a reasonable doubt. And the book is called Is Christianity for You? The subtitle, Making Sense of the Christian Faith. It's the paperback's on Amazon today for $7.99. That's a pretty good deal. And so that would be bucket number one. Bucket number two is that you at one time maybe made a profession of faith, but for whatever reason, you've sort of slipped away and you're wanting to reinvestigate, reconnect, reengage. And so I would just encourage you to find a men's group if you're a man, or a women's group if you're a woman, but find a small group of people that are trying to figure out how to do life together that you can be a part of. Generally speaking, you can do that through a church, or there are also plenty of other groups that are out there as well. And then my most well-known book is The Man in the Mirror. There are like 4 million copies of that book out there. So that's the one book I usually tell people, start with that. And it talks about the rat race and leading an unexamined life, and what's the difference between a biblical and a cultural Christian. And then the final piece is that you've been hurt by religion, and or you've been hurt by your parents. I mean, you're a bruised reed. You're fragile, and you're lashing out. You don't know why. You're withdrawing and pouting, and you don't know why. And I would really encourage you to think about this new book that I've written, From Broken Boy to Mended Man. And I just looked this morning; it's actually 50% off on Amazon, which I've never even heard of. 50% off on Amazon, but From Broken Boy to Mended Man. And I will guide you as someone who's been through the process. I could do it as a clinician, but I guide you as actually someone who's experienced it myself. So I tell lots of stories in there. And so if you're out there and you're thinking about the issue of faith and whether or not you ought to get connected or reconnected or connected in the first place, there's some options for you.
Well, I just want to say, Pat, for our readers, and I want to share just a little bit of my own personal story and what led me to reach out to you. And anybody who listens to this podcast, if you are suffering, if you're going through a hard time, and a lot of us are, I came across How God Makes Men after my father's death and after a divorce. And I was about as low as I could be. And I remember just hearing, feeling a little bit of God's presence in my life. And I remember starting to be curious about, what is God doing in my life at this point? And praying for the first time in years. And that's when I came across How God Makes Men. And I read it from cover to cover. And, Pat, it brought me healing, and it brought me some understanding. And it was part of the puzzle that got me on a path that led to me finding my wife and led to us joining a church and led to what is now the most cherished aspect of my life, which is my faith and my desire to share my faith with my newborn sons and to share my faith with others out there that might be suffering. So, ladies and gentlemen, this Dr. Morley has devoted his life to helping men and women like you and me. And he comes at it from a sophisticated point of view, a very educated point of view. He comes at it from, in some ways, a very simple but also complex point of view. And he's somebody that'll make you think. So even if you're a non-believer, even if you're somebody that has never given much thought about God or Jesus Christ, pick up his book and read it because I think it'll speak to you. I think it'll do for you what it did for me. So, Pat, I want to thank you for that because this book came to me at a time in my life when I was hurting. And it helped get me back on track. And I'm ever so humbled that you decided to join our podcast. And I thank you for the work you do, man, because it is hard work. And you following your calling, I think, is an example for all of us.
Well, I appreciate it. You have the gift of encouragement, Rob. And Matt, thank you as well for the honor of being on your show today.
Well, thank you, sir, very much. Come back anytime. You're a friend of the show. You're always welcome back, obviously. And let me just plug how folks can find you. So you have a website, patrickmorley.com. You've got a second website, maninthemere.org. I believe your books are all available on Amazon from what I can tell. Are those the best places to learn about you and the work that you do and perhaps contact you if somebody needs to do so?
Yeah, if somebody wants to get in touch, I would say go to patrickmorley.com and you can scroll down to the bottom and there's a contact button there. And then also, if you get to the bottom of the website, there's a little bit of information about me, a little bit more information about me, but also all these incredible resources for men, Bible studies. We have over 1,000 video Bible studies, 700 articles that I've written, over 700 articles, 23 books, and just all kinds of incredible resources for men. And I do a weekly email that you can sign up for at that site as well. The one today is on courage, for example. And yeah.
Well, that's great. We appreciate you sharing that. We encourage anybody who is called to do so to visit your stuff and read about your background and your work. And thank you again, sir, for your service to our country and also your service to men and women out there. And we're going to close the show. So another episode of Military Justice Today in the books. Robert, thank you very much. We'll see you guys next time. Take care and be safe.
Thanks for listening to the Military Justice Today podcast with your hosts, Robert Capovilla and Mickey Williams. This show was made possible in part by the law firm of Capovilla and Williams. For more information or to listen to more episodes, visit militaryjusticetoday.com.